On the morning of November 3rd, 1896, a mother's scream echoed through Hillcrest Girls Boarding School in Massachusetts when she discovered her 14-year-old daughter hanging in the dormitory. It was the 9th suicide in 3 years. All victims were the same age, all left identical notes, and all had been under the special care of 3 sisters who ran the school with an iron fist. When Boston detective William Hayes investigated, he discovered these weren't suicides at all. They were something far more calculated, far more cruel, and hidden behind the respectable facade of elite education. What he found in the school's basement would make him question everything he knew about human cruelty. Before we continue with this dark tale from Hillcrest, hit that subscribe button. We uncover the most disturbing true stories from history that were deliberately hidden. The body of Margaret Whitmore swayed gently in the cold November air that seeped through the dormitory window. Her mother, Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, wife of prominent Boston banker Charles Whitmore, had arrived unannounced for a surprise visit to celebrate her daughter's upcoming 15th birthday. Instead, she found Margaret suspended from a ceiling beam by a braided curtain cord, her face blue, her eyes open and staring at nothing. The scream that tore from Mrs. Whitmore's throat was heard across the entire campus, sending students scrambling from classrooms and teachers rushing up the central staircase to the 3rd-floor dormitory. Miss Eleanor Ashford arrived within 2 minutes, composed and efficient as always. She was 43 years old, tall and angular, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her already sharp features even tighter. Her 2 sisters followed close behind. Surya Ashford, 39, taught literature and deportment with the same rigid precision that characterized everything at Hillcrest. Beatrice Ashford, 36, oversaw the music and arts program with standards so exacting that students often left her lessons in tears. Eleanor's assessment of the scene was swift and practiced. She ordered the other students removed from the dormitory immediately, sent a messenger for the local doctor, and guided Mrs. Whitmore to a sitting room with the kind of firm gentleness that suggested she had performed this exact routine before, because she had. 8 times before, to be precise. Dr. Samuel Hartwell arrived within the hour. He was Hillcrest's regular physician, a gray-bearded man of 62 who had been treating the school's students for minor ailments and occasional injuries for over a decade. He examined Margaret's body with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood the legal requirements surrounding unexpected deaths. Time of death was estimated at some time between midnight and 4 in the morning. Cause of death was asphyxiation by hanging. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication of anything other than self-inflicted death. On Margaret's small writing desk, folded neatly beside her Latin textbook, was a note written in careful penmanship. Dr. Hartwell read it aloud to Eleanor Ashford and the devastated Mrs. Whitmore. The note said simply, "I am sorry for my imperfections. I cannot be what is required. Please forgive me for my failure." Margaret, Mrs. Whitmore collapsed into racking sobs. Eleanor Ashford's expression remained neutral, almost clinically detached, though she offered appropriate words of condolence. She explained to Mrs. Whitmore that Margaret had been struggling recently with the academic and social pressures of finishing school. Some girls, Eleanor said with practiced sympathy, simply lacked the fortitude to meet the high standards expected of them. It was tragic, certainly, but not entirely unexpected in an institution that demanded excellence in every aspect of comportment and education. What Eleanor did not mention was that 8 other girls had died in exactly the same manner over the past 3 years. What she did not reveal was that all 9 victims had been 14 or 15 years old. What she carefully omitted was that every single one of them had left notes with nearly identical wording, all apologizing for their imperfections and their failure to meet requirements. The local authorities, in the small town of Ashmont, Massachusetts, where Hillcrest was located, had investigated each previous death with the cursory attention typical of 1890s rural law enforcement. Suicide among young women, while tragic, was understood to be a consequence of delicate feminine constitutions and the pressures of adolescence. Each case had been closed quickly. Each family had buried their daughter quietly, ashamed of the scandal that accompanied self-inflicted death. Each investigation had accepted Eleanor Ashford's explanations without significant question, but Margaret Whitmore's death was different in one crucial aspect. Her uncle was Massachusetts State Senator Robert Whitmore, a man with both influence and connections. When Charles Whitmore wrote to his brother describing the circumstances of Margaret's death, mentioning in passing that this was apparently the 9th such suicide at Hillcrest in recent years, Senator Whitmore found the coincidence deeply troubling. 9 suicides at a single school with an enrollment of only 60 students represented a statistical anomaly that demanded explanation. Senator Whitmore contacted the Boston Police Department directly. He requested a thorough investigation, not by the small-town constable who had handled the previous cases, but by someone with experience in complex criminal investigations. The department assigned Detective William Hayes, a man whose reputation for meticulous work and unwillingness to accept convenient explanations had made him both respected and occasionally resented within the force. Hayes was 41 years old, a veteran of 15 years in law enforcement, who had worked his way up from beat patrolman through sheer competence and stubborn attention to detail. He was a compact man of medium height, with dark hair graying at the temples and sharp brown eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. He had a wife and 3 children in Boston, and he brought to his work a father's instinctive protectiveness toward the vulnerable. When Hayes arrived at Hillcrest on November 7th, 4 days after Margaret Whitmore's death, he came with authorization from the State Attorney General's office to conduct a complete investigation. Eleanor Ashford met him in the school's reception hall with cool politeness, clearly displeased by this intrusion, but too sophisticated to show open hostility. The school itself was an impressive 3-story brick building set on 15 acres of manicured grounds. It had been constructed in 1878 by Eleanor's father, Reverend Jonathan Ashford, a Congregationalist minister who had made his fortune through shrewd investments in railroad stocks. He had envisioned Hillcrest as an institution that would provide the daughters of Boston's elite with an education that combined academic rigor with the refinement of character and manner expected of women in high society. When Reverend Ashford died in 1890, he left the school to his 3 unmarried daughters, with explicit instructions that they continue his vision. Eleanor had taken over as headmistress, and under her leadership, Hillcrest had developed a reputation for transforming even the most difficult and rebellious girls into models of propriety and grace. Parents who sent their daughters to Hillcrest expected results, and Eleanor delivered them with remarkable consistency. Hayes began his investigation with a review of the school's records. Eleanor provided him with files on all 9 girls who had died, along with enrollment records, academic assessments, and correspondence with parents. On the surface, everything appeared meticulously documented and entirely proper. Each girl's file contained detailed notes about academic progress, behavioral observations, and medical examinations. But as Hayes studied the records more carefully, he began noticing patterns that troubled him. All 9 victims had been identified in their files as students requiring intensive character correction. All 9 had been placed in what the records called special supervision status between 2 and 6 months before their deaths. All 9 had shown similar behavioral changes in the weeks leading up to their suicides, becoming increasingly withdrawn, sleeping poorly, losing weight, and exhibiting what the notes described as improved compliance with institutional expectations. Hayes requested to interview current students. Eleanor initially resisted, claiming that subjecting young girls to police questioning would be traumatic and inappropriate. Only when Hayes obtained a court order did she reluctantly allow supervised interviews in her presence. The students he spoke with were uniformly composed, polite, and careful in their responses. They described Hillcrest as a demanding but fair institution where high standards were maintained through consistent discipline and clear expectations. But Hayes noticed something peculiar in how the girls spoke. They used remarkably similar language, often identical phrases when describing their experiences. They spoke about meeting requirements, achieving proper standards, and correcting imperfections in ways that sounded rehearsed rather than natural. Their body language was rigid, controlled, and he observed that they frequently glanced at Eleanor before answering questions, as if seeking approval or permission. When Hayes asked specifically about the girls who had died, the students became even more guarded. They acknowledged knowing the victims, but offered little information beyond expressing appropriate sadness. One girl, a 15-year-old named Catherine Porter, began to say something about the correction room before Eleanor smoothly interrupted, suggesting that Catherine was confused and referring to the regular detention room where students served punishment for minor infractions. Hayes made note of the interruption and the term Catherine had used. He requested to see this correction room. Eleanor showed him a small plain room on the second floor, furnished with a desk and chair, where students were required to sit in silence and write essays about their misbehavior. It seemed entirely unremarkable and hardly sinister, but Hayes was not satisfied. He had learned through years of detective work that the truth often hid behind surfaces that appeared normal. He began examining the school more thoroughly, paying attention to details that might seem insignificant. He noticed that certain areas of the school were restricted to students, including the entire basement level and a section of the third floor. When he asked about these restrictions, Eleanor explained that the basement contained mechanical systems and storage that posed safety hazards, while the restricted third floor area was the private quarters of the teaching staff. Hayes accepted these explanations, but filed them away as points requiring further investigation. He interviewed Dr. Hartwell, who had examined all 9 bodies. The doctor was emphatic that each death showed clear evidence of suicide, with no indication of foul play. The consistency of method, the suicide notes, and the lack of any physical evidence suggesting coercion all pointed to self-inflicted death. Yet Hayes remained troubled. 9 suicides in 3 years at a school with 60 students represented an extraordinary rate. National statistics suggested that suicide among young women in this demographic was extremely rare, perhaps 1 case per 10,000 annually. Hillcrest was experiencing a rate thousands of times higher than the national average. Something at this school was driving these girls to take their own lives with disturbing regularity. Hayes decided to dig deeper into the backgrounds of the 3 Ashford sisters. Eleanor, Victoria, and Beatrice had never married, unusual for women of their social standing in an era when marriage was considered the natural and expected path for females. They had devoted their lives to running Hillcrest, living together in the staff quarters and rarely leaving the campus except for necessary business in Boston. Investigation into their past revealed some interesting details. Eleanor had briefly attended a women's normal school in New York in the early 1870s, but had been expelled for reasons the records did not specify. Victoria had worked for several years as a governess for wealthy families in Philadelphia before returning to Massachusetts under circumstances that were similarly vague. Beatrice had spent time at a psychiatric institution in Hartford in 1882, officially for treatment of nervous exhaustion, though Hayes noted that nervous exhaustion was often a euphemism for a range of conditions that families preferred not to discuss publicly. The Ashford family history contained other troubling elements. Their father, Reverend Jonathan Ashford, had been a strict Calvinist who preached extensively about human depravity and the necessity of breaking the will to achieve salvation. His sermons, some of which Hayes obtained from church archives, contained disturbing themes about the inherent wickedness of female nature and the need for constant vigilance and correction to prevent moral corruption. Their mother, Sarah Ashford, had died in 1871 under circumstances recorded as accidental drowning, though Hayes noticed that the death had occurred in the family's bathtub rather than in natural water. The official explanation was that she had suffered a fainting spell and drowned, but Hayes wondered if there might be more to the story. Sarah's death had occurred when Eleanor was 18, Victoria 14, and Beatrice 11, leaving the three girls to be raised by their father without maternal influence. Hayes compiled all of this information, building a picture of three women shaped by a harsh upbringing under a father who viewed female nature as inherently corrupt and requiring forceful correction. They had taken over an institution designed to refine young women and had apparently pushed those refinement methods to an extreme that was literally killing their students. But knowing something was wrong and proving it were different matters. Hayes needed concrete evidence of wrongdoing, not just troubling patterns and suspicious circumstances. He needed to understand exactly what was happening at Hillcrest that was driving these girls to suicide, and he suspected that the answer lay in the restricted areas of the school, particularly the mysterious correction room that Catherine Porter had mentioned before being silenced. On November 12th, Hayes returned to Hillcrest with a warrant to search the entire premises, including all restricted areas. Eleanor Ashford received the warrant with barely concealed anger, her composure finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. She protested that such an invasion was outrageous and would traumatize the students, but Hayes was unmoved. He had authority from the court, and he intended to use it fully. The search began in the basement. Hayes and two officers descended the stairs with lanterns, finding themselves in a maze of corridors lined with storage rooms, the boiler room, and various mechanical spaces. Most were exactly as Eleanor had described, mundane and unremarkable. But at the far end of the longest corridor, Hayes found a heavy door secured with a substantial lock, far more secure than necessary for simple storage. When Eleanor was asked for the key, she claimed not to have it, saying that particular room had been locked for years, and she had no idea where the key might be. Hayes had the lock forced. The door swung open to reveal a space that made his blood run cold. The room was approximately 15 feet square with bare stone walls and a concrete floor. There was no window, no source of natural light or fresh air. In the center of the room stood a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. On the walls hung various implements, leather straps, wooden paddles, and what appeared to be specialized restraining devices. A small table in the corner held notebooks filled with detailed handwritten observations. Hayes picked up one of the notebooks and began reading by lantern light. What he found documented in meticulous detail was a systematic program of psychological torture that the Ashford sisters had been implementing on selected students for years. The notebooks described isolation sessions lasting days, sleep deprivation protocols, carefully calibrated humiliation exercises, and something called ego dissolution therapy that appeared to be designed to completely break down a student's sense of self before rebuilding it. According to the sisters' specifications, the entries were clinical and detailed, written in what Hayes recognized as Eleanor's precise handwriting. They described student responses to various interventions, noted which techniques produced the most effective compliance results, and tracked the progress of individual girls through what the notes called the refinement process. The most recent entries detailed Margaret Whitmore's final weeks at Hillcrest. Hayes felt physically ill as he read the calculated cruelty documented in these pages. This was not education or even harsh discipline. This was systematic psychological destruction carried out with scientific precision, and the Ashford sisters had been doing it for years, refining their methods, documenting their results, and destroying young girls in the name of creating proper ladies. He ordered his officers to seize all the notebooks and secure the room as evidence. Then he went to find Eleanor Ashford, knowing that what he had discovered was going to shake Boston society to its foundations, and reveal that behind the respectable facade of elite education, something monstrous had been occurring. The investigation was only beginning, but Hayes already knew enough to understand that Margaret Whitmore and the 8 girls before her had not committed suicide because of personal weakness or adolescent melancholy. They had been driven to it, systematically and deliberately, by 3 women who had turned their father's harsh philosophies into a machine for breaking human spirits. And Hayes was determined that the Ashford sisters would face justice for every life they had destroyed. Detective William Hayes emerged from the basement of Hillcrest Girls Boarding School, carrying an armful of notebooks that contained the most disturbing documentation he had encountered in 15 years of police work. The leather-bound journals detailed a systematic program of psychological destruction that the Ashford sisters had refined over years of practice. Each entry was written with the clinical detachment of a scientist recording laboratory observations, but the subjects were not laboratory animals. They were teenage girls from Boston's wealthiest families, entrusted to Hillcrest for education and refinement. Hayes found Eleanor Ashford in her office, on the 2nd floor, seated behind a massive mahogany desk, with her hands folded calmly on the polished surface. Victoria and Beatrice stood on either side of her like sentinels, their expressions carefully neutral. The 3 sisters presented a united front, their postures identical, their faces revealing nothing. Hayes had interviewed hundreds of criminals over his career, and he recognized the particular stillness that came over people who knew they had been caught, but had not yet decided how to respond. He placed the notebooks on Eleanor's desk with deliberate care, making sure she could see the evidence of what he had discovered. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the ornate clock on the office wall, marking seconds that seemed to stretch into minutes. Hayes watched Eleanor's face carefully, looking for any crack in her composure, any sign of guilt or fear or remorse. He saw none. Her gray eyes met his steadily, assessing, calculating, showing nothing but cold intelligence. Hayes had brought 2 officers with him, and he now instructed them to secure the building and ensure that no one left the premises. Then he sent for the local magistrate and the county prosecutor. What he had discovered was going to require immediate legal action, and he wanted proper authority present before proceeding further. While they waited for the officials to arrive, Hayes began a more thorough search of the school, particularly the restricted areas that Eleanor had claimed were simply staff quarters. The 3rd floor of Hillcrest contained the living spaces for the teaching staff, but it also held several rooms that Hayes immediately recognized as holding cells rather than bedrooms. These rooms were small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with heavy doors that locked from the outside. Each contained only a narrow bed, with a thin mattress, a chamber pot, and nothing else. No windows, no books, no decorations. The walls were painted a uniform institutional gray that seemed designed to be as featureless and oppressive as possible. In one of these rooms, Hayes found evidence that it had been recently occupied. The mattress showed the impression of a body, and a wooden tray near the door held the remains of what appeared to be a sparse meal of bread and water. He noted that the door's lock was substantial, and that soundproofing material had been installed around the frame, presumably to prevent noise from escaping into the hallway. This was not a bedroom, it was a cell designed for isolation. Hayes questioned the current students again, this time more forcefully, and without Eleanor's supervision. Several girls initially maintained the same carefully controlled responses they had given before, but when Hayes explained that he had found the basement room and the isolation cells, some of them finally began to speak more freely. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of systematic psychological torture that went far beyond anything Hayes had imagined. The Ashford sisters had developed what they called a character refinement program for students identified as having behavioral or attitude problems. Parents sent their daughters to Hillcrest specifically because the school had a reputation for transforming difficult girls into obedient, refined young women. What the parents did not know was the methods used to achieve these transformations. Girls selected for the program were first isolated from their peers, moved from the regular dormitories to the third-floor cells. They were told this was for their own benefit, that they needed intensive correction to overcome their imperfections. The isolation began with physical separation, removing them from any social contact or stimulation. They were kept in the grey rooms for days at a time, let out only for carefully supervised bathroom breaks and occasional exercise in a small courtyard surrounded by high walls. During isolation, the girls were subjected to what the Ashford sisters called reflection exercises. They were required to sit in complete silence and contemplate their failures and imperfections. Any sound, any movement beyond what was absolutely necessary, resulted in extensions of the isolation period. Some girls spent weeks in these cells, completely cut off from human interaction, except for brief encounters with Eleanor Victoria or Beatrice, who would enter periodically to deliver lectures about the girls' deficiencies. The food provided during isolation was deliberately minimal: a piece of bread and water for breakfast, a small portion of plain rice or potato for lunch, another piece of bread for dinner. The inadequate nutrition was intentional, designed to weaken the girls physically and make them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The Ashford sisters had discovered that hunger amplified feelings of worthlessness and despair, making their subjects more compliant and easier to control. Sleep deprivation was another key element of the program. The isolation cells were equipped with bells that could be rung remotely at irregular intervals throughout the night. Girls were required to respond to each bell by standing at attention until given permission to return to bed. This permission might come after 5 minutes or after an hour. The unpredictability was intentional, preventing deep sleep and creating constant anxiety about when the next interruption would occur. After several weeks of this treatment, girls were moved to the basement room that Hayes had discovered. This was where the final stage of the refinement process occurred. Strapped into the chair with leather restraints, unable to move, girls were subjected to what Eleanor's notebooks described as ego dissolution therapy. This involved hours of verbal abuse, carefully calibrated humiliation, and psychological manipulation designed to completely break down the girl's sense of self. Eleanor, Victoria, and Beatrice took turns conducting these sessions. They would tell the restrained girl, in exhaustive detail, exactly how worthless, defective, and irredeemably flawed she was. They would list every mistake, every perceived imperfection, every failure to meet their impossible standards. They would explain that the girl's very existence was a burden to her family, that she caused nothing but disappointment and shame, that she was fundamentally broken in ways that could never be fully repaired. The sessions lasted for hours, sometimes 8 or 10 hours at a stretch. The girl would be unable to move, unable to escape, forced to absorb this constant stream of psychological abuse. When she tried to defend herself or protest, the sisters would become even more harsh, explaining that her resistance proved how deeply defective she truly was. The only acceptable response was complete acceptance of every accusation, total agreement that she was worthless and needed to be rebuilt from nothing. Between these intensive sessions, the girls were returned to the isolation cells where they were required to write essays, acknowledging their deficiencies and begging for the opportunity to be corrected. These essays had to meet exacting standards of self-abasement. Any hint of self-defense or pride would result in the essay being rejected, and the girl being sent back to the basement for another round of what the sisters called clarification therapy. The notebooks documented the progress of each girl through this program with clinical precision. Eleanor tracked weight loss, sleep deprivation hours, number of dissolution sessions, and the girl's level of compliance measured on a scale from 1 to 10. She noted which techniques produced the best results, which girls broke most quickly, and which required extended treatment. The entries read like a scientist documenting experiments, completely devoid of any recognition that these were human beings suffering profound psychological damage. Most girls who went through the program emerged fundamentally changed. They became quiet, obedient, and eerily compliant. They spoke in the careful, controlled manner that Hayes had noticed in his interviews. They used the same phrases about meeting requirements and correcting imperfections because these were the phrases that had been drilled into them during their breaking. They had learned that any assertion of individual will or personality would result in being sent back to the basement, so they became blank versions of themselves, performing the role of proper young lady, without any authentic self remaining beneath the performance. But 9 girls had not survived the process. The notebooks revealed that these 9 had responded differently to the refinement program. Instead of breaking and becoming compliant, they had internalized the abuse to such a degree that they came to genuinely believe they were irredeemably worthless. The constant messages about their defectiveness, delivered during periods of physical weakness and psychological vulnerability, had convinced them that they were burdens who did not deserve to exist. Eleanor's notes on these 9 cases showed that she had recognized they were becoming suicidal, but had viewed this as an unfortunate but acceptable outcome. In several entries, she wrote about the necessary casualties in any program of character reformation. She noted that some materials were too flawed to be properly refined, and that their removal from the program was perhaps for the best. The clinical language could not disguise the horrifying reality. Eleanor Ashford had knowingly driven these girls to suicide and had viewed their deaths as acceptable losses. The notebooks also revealed something even more disturbing. The Ashford sisters believed completely in what they were doing. They were not sadists enjoying the suffering they inflicted. They genuinely believed they were performing a valuable service, correcting flawed human material and creating properly refined young women. Their father's harsh Calvinist theology had convinced them that human nature, particularly female nature, was inherently corrupt and required forceful breaking to achieve any kind of virtue. Eleanor had written extensive philosophical justifications for the program. She argued that modern society had become too soft, too permissive, allowing young women to develop personalities and wills of their own, when what they truly needed was to be shaped into instruments of propriety and grace. The pain inflicted during the refinement process was necessary pain, like the pain of surgery or the setting of a broken bone. It was cruel to be kind, breaking girls down so they could be rebuilt properly. Victoria's contributions to the notebooks focused on the practical applications of the program. She had developed the specific verbal scripts used during the dissolution sessions, carefully crafted phrases designed to maximize psychological impact. She had studied rhetoric and persuasion, and she had applied these skills to the task of destroying young women's self-worth with maximum efficiency. Her notes included observations about which types of criticism worked best on which personality types, how to identify a girl's deepest insecurities and exploit them most effectively. Beatrice's entries dealt with the musical and artistic elements of the program. She had discovered that forcing girls to perform music or create art during and after their breaking could be useful for reinforcing their transformation. A girl who had been told repeatedly that she was worthless would be required to play piano or paint, then criticized brutally for her inevitable imperfections, reinforcing the message that everything about her was defective. The combination of creative expression and harsh criticism created particularly deep psychological wounds. As Hayes read through these notebooks, he felt growing horror at the sophistication of the cruelty documented in their pages. The Ashford sisters had created a comprehensive system of psychological torture, refined through years of practice, and they had applied it to dozens of girls over the past decade. The 9 who had died were only the most visible casualties. Hayes could only imagine the psychological damage carried by the girls who had survived, who had returned to their families permanently scarred by their time at Hillcrest. When the magistrate and county prosecutor arrived, Hayes presented them with the evidence he had gathered. The men were visibly shaken as they examined the notebooks and inspected the isolation cells and basement torture chamber. This was not a case they had been prepared to handle. Child abuse and psychological torture by respectable members of society operating under the guise of education was outside their normal experience. The prosecutor, a man named James Thornton, recognized immediately that this case would create enormous scandal. The families who had sent their daughters to Hillcrest included some of the most prominent names in Boston. Revealing what had happened at the school would expose these families to public scrutiny and embarrassment. Many of them would be horrified to learn what their daughters had endured. Others might be complicit, having known or suspected that Hillcrest's methods were harsh but valuing the results more than the welfare of their daughters. Thornton made the decision to arrest all 3 Ashford sisters immediately on charges of assault, false imprisonment, and involuntary manslaughter in the deaths of the 9 girls who had committed suicide. Hayes supervised as officers placed Eleanor, Victoria, and Beatrice in custody. The sisters maintained their composure throughout the arrest, showing no emotion beyond faint disdain for the process. Eleanor stated calmly that they had done nothing wrong, that they had been performing their duties as educators, and that any investigation would vindicate their methods. The arrest sent shockwaves through Boston society. Newspapers seized on the story, publishing sensational accounts of the torture chamber discovered at the elite boarding school. Parents who had daughters at Hillcrest rushed to retrieve them, horrified by the revelations. Some parents of the girls who had survived the refinement program began recognizing in retrospect the signs of trauma they had attributed to normal adolescent development or the stress of demanding education. Hayes interviewed more of the surviving victims as the investigation expanded. Some were able to speak about their experiences, though many broke down in tears as they recalled the isolation, the hunger, the sleep deprivation, and the hours strapped to the chair being told they were worthless. Others refused to discuss what had happened, their trauma too fresh and too deep to be examined. A few insisted that the program had been necessary and beneficial, that they had been difficult girls who needed harsh correction. These responses troubled Hayes most of all, suggesting that the psychological damage ran so deep that victims had identified with their abusers. Medical examinations of girls who had recently completed the refinement program revealed evidence of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and psychological trauma. Doctors documented weight loss, stress-related physical symptoms, and behavioral indicators of severe anxiety and depression. The physical evidence corroborated the testimony and the documentation in Eleanor's notebooks, building a comprehensive case that the Ashford sisters had engaged in systematic abuse over a period of years. As the investigation progressed, Hayes discovered that some parents had known their daughters were being subjected to harsh treatment, but had accepted this as the price of transformation. These parents had sent difficult, rebellious girls to Hillcrest, specifically because of its reputation for breaking spirit and enforcing compliance. They had received reports that their daughters were undergoing intensive correction and had approved these measures, believing that harsh discipline was necessary and appropriate for girls who refused to conform to social expectations. This realization complicated the case significantly. If parents had known about and approved harsh treatment, even if they had not known the full extent of the abuse, could they be held partially responsible? The question raised uncomfortable issues about parental authority, the limits of educational discipline, and society's willingness to tolerate cruelty toward children when that cruelty was framed as character building. Hayes focused on building the strongest possible case against the Ashford sisters themselves. Whatever responsibility parents might bear for sending their daughters to Hillcrest, the sisters were the ones who had designed and implemented the program. They were the ones who had documented their methods in meticulous detail. They were the ones who had recognized that girls were becoming suicidal and had allowed the program to continue regardless. The trial was scheduled for February 1897, giving prosecutors time to prepare their case and defense attorneys time to mount whatever defense they could construct. Hayes knew the trial would be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in Massachusetts history. It would force society to confront questions about the treatment of children, the limits of educational authority, and the fine line between discipline and torture. But before the trial could begin, something happened that would complicate the case in ways no one had anticipated. On December 3rd, exactly 1 month after Margaret Whitmore's death, a fire broke out at Hillcrest Girls Boarding School. By the time firefighters brought it under control, the entire 3rd floor had been destroyed, along with much of the 2nd floor. The isolation cells, the grey rooms where girls had been broken, were reduced to charred ruins. Investigators determined that the fire had been deliberately set, but they could not determine who had started it. The school had been largely empty at the time, with most students already withdrawn by their parents. The few remaining staff members had all been accounted for during the fire, and none showed signs of having set it. Hayes suspected that one of the victims, perhaps one who had suffered through the refinement program, had returned to destroy the place of their torture. He could not blame them. The destruction of the physical evidence complicated the prosecution's case, though the notebooks remained intact, having been secured as evidence before the fire. The trial would proceed, but without the ability to show jurors the actual rooms where the abuse had occurred. Hayes worried that this might make it easier for defense attorneys to minimize the horror of what had happened, to argue that the Ashford sisters' methods, while perhaps excessive, had not been as brutal as prosecutors claimed. As December progressed and preparations for trial continued, Hayes received a letter that changed his understanding of the case once again. The letter was from a woman named Sarah Crawford, who identified herself as a former student at Hillcrest from 1889 to 1891. She had survived the refinement program and had spent the 5 years since her graduation trying to recover from the psychological damage it had inflicted. She wanted to testify at the trial, to tell the court exactly what the Ashford sisters had done and how it had affected her life. Hayes met with Sarah in Boston. She was 23 years old, thin and nervous, with shadows under her eyes that suggested years of poor sleep. She described her time at Hillcrest in halting sentences, sometimes stopping mid-thought as memories overwhelmed her. She explained that she had been sent to the school because her parents considered her too opinionated and willful. The refinement program had broken her, transformed her into a compliant shell who could barely function. Sarah told Hayes that she still heard Eleanor Ashford's voice in her head, telling her she was worthless, defective, a burden to everyone around her. She had attempted suicide twice since leaving Hillcrest, unable to escape the conviction that she did not deserve to exist. Only the support of a sympathetic doctor and her younger sister, had kept her alive. She wanted to testify so that people would understand what the Ashford sisters had really done, so that other girls might be spared what she had endured. Hayes knew that Sarah's testimony would be powerful evidence at trial. Here was a living victim, who could describe in detail what the notebooks documented in clinical language. Her testimony would make the horror real for jurors in ways that written records could not. He began preparing her for what would be a difficult and traumatic experience of reliving her abuse in a public courtroom. As 1896 came to a close, Hayes reviewed everything he had learned about Hillcrest and the Ashford sisters. He had uncovered a systematic program of psychological torture that had operated for years under the respectable facade of elite education. He had documented the deaths of 9 girls and the severe psychological damage inflicted on dozens more. He had evidence that should be more than sufficient for conviction, but he also understood that this case touched on uncomfortable truths about society's treatment of young women, about parental authority and educational discipline, about the cruelty that could hide behind refinement and propriety. The trial of the Ashford sisters would force these questions into public view, and Hayes was not certain how society would respond. Would there be justice for the victims, or would discomfort with the implications lead to a desire to minimize what had happened and move on quickly? The answers would come in the trial that lay ahead, a proceeding that would captivate the nation and force a reckoning with the dark side of Victorian ideals about feminine perfection and the breaking of will that was sometimes required to achieve it. The trial of Eleanor Victoria and Beatrice Ashford began on February 8, 1897, in the Suffolk County Superior Court in Boston. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and members of Boston's elite society, who had come to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. The prosecution was led by District Attorney James Thornton, assisted by 2 experienced prosecutors from the State Attorney General's office. The defense team consisted of 3 prominent Boston attorneys who had been hired by the Ashford family's remaining relatives, determined to protect the family name, even as evidence of horrific crimes mounted. Judge Marcus Wellington presided over the proceedings with stern authority. He was 67 years old, a veteran of the Massachusetts bench, known for his strict interpretation of law and his intolerance for theatrics in his courtroom. He had reviewed the evidence presented by Detective William Hayes and had been visibly disturbed by what he read. Now he was tasked with ensuring that justice was served while maintaining proper legal procedures in what promised to be an emotionally charged trial. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. They would present the notebooks seized from Hillcrest as primary evidence, documenting in the Ashford sisters' own words the systematic program of psychological torture they had implemented. They would call medical experts to testify about the physical and psychological effects of the treatment described in those notebooks. They would present testimony from surviving victims who could describe firsthand what they had endured, and they would demonstrate that 9 young women had died as a direct result of the treatment they received at Hillcrest. The defense faced a difficult challenge. The evidence against their clients was overwhelming and documented in meticulous detail. Their strategy focused on arguing that the Ashford sisters had been engaged in legitimate educational discipline that, while perhaps excessive by modern standards, did not constitute criminal behavior. They argued that parents had sent their daughters to Hillcrest specifically for strict discipline and character correction, that the school had operated openly for years without interference, and that the tragic suicides were the result of pre-existing mental instability in the victims, rather than any criminal action by the defendants. The trial opened with prosecution witnesses who established the basic facts of the case. Dr. Samuel Hartwell testified about the 9 deaths he had examined, all showing evidence of suicide by hanging. The local constable who had investigated several of the earlier deaths testified about the cursory nature of those investigations and his acceptance of Eleanor Ashford's explanations without deeper inquiry. These witnesses established that 9 girls had died at Hillcrest, under circumstances initially ruled as straightforward suicide. Then Detective Hayes took the stand. Over 3 days of testimony, he walked the jury through his investigation step by step. He described finding the locked room in the basement with its restraining chair and implements. He detailed the discovery of Eleanor's notebooks and read selected passages aloud to the jury. The courtroom fell silent as Hayes read clinical descriptions of girls being strapped into chairs for 8-hour sessions of verbal abuse, of sleep deprivation protocols designed to break psychological resistance, of isolation cells where girls were kept in complete sensory deprivation for weeks at a time. Hayes testified about his interviews with current and former students, about the patterns he had identified in the deaths, about the sophisticated system of psychological manipulation the Ashford sisters had developed. He presented the notebooks as evidence, and the prosecution entered dozens of pages into the record. The jury was given copies to review, and several jurors visibly recoiled as they read Eleanor's cold assessments of which girls were breaking properly and which required more intensive treatment. The defense attorneys attempted to undermine Hayes's testimony through cross-examination. They suggested that he had misinterpreted educational discipline as abuse, that methods which seemed harsh to modern sensibilities had been standard practice in strict educational institutions for generations. They pointed out that corporal punishment was legal and widely accepted, that parents had the right to demand strict discipline for their children, and that the Ashford sisters had been hired specifically to provide such discipline. But Hayes was an experienced witness who had testified in dozens of trials. He calmly pointed out the differences between corporal punishment and psychological torture, between discipline and systematic breaking of human spirit. He noted that the Ashford sisters had gone to great lengths to hide their methods from parents and from public view, suggesting they knew their actions would not be acceptable if widely known. He emphasized that they had documented girls becoming suicidal and had continued the program regardless, demonstrating criminal indifference to human life. The prosecution then called medical experts who testified about the effects of the treatment described in the notebooks. Dr. Benjamin Marcus, a physician specializing in nervous disorders, explained to the jury how prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, starvation, and sustained psychological abuse could cause severe and permanent mental damage. He described how the techniques documented in the Ashford notebooks were specifically designed to break down personality and sense of self, creating profound psychological trauma. Dr. Marcus testified that the 9 girls who had committed suicide had been driven to it by the treatment they received. The combination of physical weakness from inadequate food, psychological vulnerability from isolation and sleep deprivation, and sustained verbal abuse telling them they were worthless, had created conditions where suicide became a rational response in the victim's damaged psychological state. The deaths were not the result of pre-existing mental illness. They were the predictable outcome of systematic psychological torture. The most powerful testimony came from the surviving victims. Sarah Crawford took the stand on the 7th day of trial. She was visibly nervous, her hands shaking as she was sworn in, but once she began speaking, her testimony was devastating. She described being isolated in the 3rd-floor cells for 3 weeks, receiving only bread and water, being woken every hour throughout the night by bells that required her to stand at attention in the darkness. Sarah testified about being taken to the basement room and strapped into the chair while Eleanor, Victoria, and Beatrice took turns, telling her in exhaustive detail how worthless and defective she was. She described how after hours of this treatment, she had begun to believe them, had genuinely come to see herself as irredeemably flawed. She explained that 5 years after leaving Hillcrest, she still struggled daily with suicidal thoughts, still heard Eleanor Ashford's voice in her head, telling her she did not deserve to exist. The defense attorneys were reluctant to cross-examine Sarah aggressively, recognizing that attacking a sympathetic victim would alienate the jury. They attempted gently to suggest that Sarah had been a difficult student who required firm correction, that her parents had consented to strict discipline, and that any lasting psychological effects were unfortunate but not criminal. Sarah responded that no parent would consent to what had been done to her if they had truly understood the nature of the treatment. Her parents had believed Hillcrest was strict, but had no idea it was a torture chamber. 3 other former students testified with similar accounts. Each described the isolation, the hunger, the sleep deprivation, and the hours of psychological abuse. Each explained how the treatment had damaged them permanently, leaving them with anxiety, depression, and lasting trauma. Their testimony painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went far beyond any reasonable definition of educational discipline. The prosecution also called parents of some of the 9 girls who had died. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore testified about finding her daughter Margaret hanging in the dormitory. She described the girl she had sent to Hillcrest, spirited and intelligent, and contrasted that with the withdrawn, terrified girl she had visited months before Margaret's death. Mrs. Whitmore stated that if she had known what was happening at Hillcrest, she would never have left her daughter there. She broke down sobbing on the witness stand as she described her guilt for not recognizing the signs of abuse. Other parents gave similar testimony. They had sent difficult daughters to Hillcrest, expecting strict discipline and character building. They had noticed their daughters becoming quieter and more compliant during visits, but had interpreted this as evidence that the school's methods were working. None had understood that their daughters were being tortured. None had consented to treatment that would drive their children to suicide. The defense called character witnesses, who testified that the Ashford sisters were respected educators who had devoted their lives to improving young women. Former students who had not been subjected to the refinement program testified that their experience at Hillcrest had been positive and beneficial. The defense argued that the prosecution was focusing on a small subset of troubled students while ignoring the many girls who had benefited from Hillcrest's rigorous standards. But these defense witnesses struggled under cross-examination. Prosecutors pointed out that students who had been compliant and met the school's standards had not been subjected to the refinement program, so their positive experiences said nothing about what happened to girls who were targeted for intensive correction. The fact that most students had normal experiences did not excuse the torture of those who did not. The Ashford sisters themselves chose not to testify. Their attorneys advised them that taking the stand would expose them to cross-examination that could be devastating. Instead, the defense relied on arguing that the prosecution had not proven criminal intent. The sisters had genuinely believed they were helping troubled girls through firm discipline. Their methods might have been misguided, but misguided educational philosophy was not a crime. In closing arguments, District Attorney Thornton systematically destroyed this defense. He read passage after passage from Eleanor's notebooks showing clear awareness that girls were being psychologically destroyed. He pointed to entries where Eleanor had noted girls becoming suicidal and had continued the program regardless. He argued that the sophisticated nature of the psychological techniques employed demonstrated deliberate intent to cause harm, not misguided attempts to help. Thornton held up photographs of the isolation cells, the restraining chair, and the implements found in the basement. He asked the jury whether these looked like educational tools or instruments of torture. He reminded them of Sarah Crawford's testimony, of her description of hours strapped in a chair being told she was worthless. He asked whether this could be characterized as anything other than deliberate infliction of psychological torture. The defense's closing argument attempted to frame the case as a clash between old standards and new sensibilities. They argued that methods which had been acceptable for generations were now being retroactively condemned. They suggested that the prosecution was criminalizing strict discipline because society had become too permissive. They asked the jury to consider whether they wanted to open the door to prosecuting every teacher or parent who imposed firm discipline on a difficult child, but the prosecution had the final word in rebuttal. Thornton pointed out that there was a clear distinction between firm discipline and systematic torture, between punishment and psychological destruction. He reminded the jury that 9 girls were dead, that dozens more carried permanent psychological scars, and that the Ashford sisters had documented their methods with the clinical detachment of torturers who felt no remorse for the suffering they inflicted. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning with their verdict. On February 28, 1897, they found Eleanor Ashford guilty of 9 counts of involuntary manslaughter, multiple counts of assault, and multiple counts of false imprisonment. Victoria Ashford and Beatrice Ashford were found guilty of the same charges. The courtroom erupted in reaction, with some spectators applauding the verdict while others gasped in shock that respected educators had been convicted of such serious crimes. Judge Wellington scheduled sentencing for March 15. In the intervening weeks, newspapers across the nation covered the verdict extensively. Editorial pages debated the implications of the case. Some writers praised the verdict as necessary justice for the victims and a warning that child abuse would not be tolerated, regardless of who committed it or how it was justified. Others worried that the verdict would discourage strict discipline in education and lead to a generation of undisciplined children. At sentencing, Judge Wellington delivered a statement that would be widely quoted in the years that followed. He acknowledged that educational discipline had traditionally been harsh and that societal standards were evolving. But he stated firmly that what the Ashford sisters had done went far beyond any reasonable definition of discipline. They had systematically tortured children in their care. They had driven 9 girls to suicide through deliberate psychological abuse. They had damaged dozens more permanently. Judge Wellington sentenced Eleanor Ashford to 20 years in prison. Victoria Ashford and Beatrice Ashford each received 15-year sentences. The sentences were harsh by the standards of the time, particularly for women of their social standing. But Judge Wellington stated that the severity of their crimes and the vulnerability of their victims demanded significant punishment. He noted that the Ashford sisters had been in positions of trust and authority and had abused that trust in the most horrific manner imaginable. The Ashford sisters showed no emotion as they were sentenced. They maintained to the end that they had done nothing wrong, that they had been performing their duties as educators according to the highest standards. They were led from the courtroom and transported to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham, where they would serve their sentences. The aftermath of the trial brought significant changes to educational regulations in Massachusetts and eventually across the nation. Legislators passed laws requiring regular inspections of boarding schools, establishing standards for the treatment of students, and creating mechanisms for reporting suspected abuse. The case of the Ashford sisters became a touchstone in discussions about children's rights and the limits of parental and educational authority. For the surviving victims, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but could not undo the damage they had suffered. Sarah Crawford and the other women who had testified received support from a fund established by some of the victims' families, allowing them to receive medical and psychological treatment. But the scars remained. Several of the survivors struggled with mental health issues for the rest of their lives. At least 2 others would later die by suicide, unable to escape the psychological damage inflicted at Hillcrest. Detective William Hayes continued his work with the Boston Police Department, eventually rising to the rank of inspector, but he would later say that the Hillcrest case was the most disturbing investigation of his career. The calculated cruelty documented in Eleanor Ashford's notebooks haunted him for years. He kept copies of several pages as a reminder of the capacity for evil that could hide behind respectable facades and noble-sounding philosophies. The building that had housed Hillcrest Girls Boarding School was never repaired after the fire. It stood as a burned-out shell for several years before being demolished in 1903. The land was eventually sold and redeveloped, with no marker indicating what had occurred there. The families involved preferred to forget, to move on from a scandal that had exposed uncomfortable truths about their willingness to send difficult daughters to be broken rather than nurtured. Eleanor Ashford died in prison in 1908 at age 55 from pneumonia. Victoria died in 1911, and Beatrice survived until 1919, serving her full sentence and being released at age 59. None of them ever expressed remorse for what they had done at Hillcrest. To the end, they maintained that they had been engaged in necessary work, refining flawed human material into proper young women, and that society's condemnation of their methods was evidence of growing moral weakness. The case remained largely forgotten for decades after the trial. The families involved had the wealth and influence to keep the story from being frequently retold. But in the 1960s and 1970s, as society began re-examining historical treatment of children and women, historians rediscovered the Hillcrest case. The notebooks that Eleanor Ashford had kept, preserved as evidence, and eventually deposited in state archives, provided chilling documentation of systematic child abuse carried out with scientific precision. Modern psychologists who have studied the case recognize the techniques documented in the notebooks as sophisticated psychological torture methods that would later be refined and employed by various authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century. The Ashford sisters had independently discovered, through trial and error, many of the same principles that would later be formally studied as brainwashing and coercive persuasion. Their work at Hillcrest represented an early and horrifying example of systematic psychological manipulation designed to destroy and rebuild human personality. The legacy of Hillcrest serves as a dark reminder of the dangers of absolute authority over vulnerable people, of the cruelty that can be justified by noble-sounding philosophies, and of the importance of protecting children from abuse regardless of who commits it or how it is rationalized. The 9 girls who died at Hillcrest and the many more who survived with permanent psychological scars paid the price for society's willingness to accept cruelty disguised as education and discipline disguised as torture. The Ashford sisters believed they were creating perfect young ladies by breaking imperfect girls. Instead, they destroyed lives, shattered families, and ultimately destroyed themselves. Their story stands as testament to the human capacity for calculated cruelty and the critical importance of questioning authority, protecting the vulnerable, and recognizing that there are limits to discipline that cannot be crossed without becoming torture. What happened at Hillcrest Girls Boarding School between 1893 and 1896 was not education. It was systematic psychological destruction carried out by 3 women who had confused breaking spirit with building character, who had mistaken compliance born of trauma for genuine improvement, and who had convinced themselves that the suffering they inflicted was necessary and noble. The verdict in their trial sent a message that would echo through the decades: no amount of respectability, no claims of educational purpose, and no philosophy of character building can justify the deliberate torture of children. The 9 girls who died at Hillcrest deserve to be remembered not as suicides, but as victims of calculated abuse. Margaret Whitmore, whose death finally triggered the investigation that exposed the truth, and the 8 who died before her, all deserved better than what they received. Their deaths forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about the treatment of children and the limits of authority, and their memory serves as a permanent warning about what can happen when cruelty hides behind the mask of refinement and torture masquerades as education. If this story opened your eyes to the dark side of history that's often hidden from us, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. We bring you true stories that were deliberately buried, scandals that shook societies, and crimes that changed how we think about justice. Your support helps us continue uncovering these important historical truths. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.